The legacy of European colonialism is a dark and troubled one, marked by brutal violence, exploitation, and oppression. For centuries, European powers ravaged the globe, leaving in their wake a trail of destruction, devastation, and despair. From the Americas to Africa, Asia to the Pacific, the impact of colonialism was felt far and wide. Every European colonial empire, from the Spanish to the British, French to German, Belgian to Italian, was complicit in atrocities that would later be recognized as crimes against humanity. In today's video, we'll be embarking on a poignant journey to confront the brutal truths of colonialism, acknowledging the sufferings of the past and honoring the memories of those who were lost. Before we get right into it, don't forget to usher some support by hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and consider subscribing to our channel to stay tuned in with us if you're yet to. Now let us dive in. Number 1. British colonialism, 15th to mid-20th century. As the 15th century began to draw to a close, European powers, including Britain, began to explore and colonize Africa, marking the beginning of a brutal and exploitative era that would last for centuries. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, was one of the most heinous aspects of British colonialism. During this period, millions of Africans were brutally ripped from their homelands, sold into bondage, and subjected to an unspeakable journey across the Atlantic. The conditions on slave ships were a living nightmare, where enslaved people were packed like cattle, denied basic humanity, and treated with unimaginable cruelty. Women and girls were repeatedly raped by ship captains and crew members, their bodies brutalized and their dignity shattered. Pregnant women were forced to endure the journey, often giving birth on the ship's deck or in cramped, filthy holds. Many did not survive childbirth, and their babies were often callously discarded overboard. Children, some as young as 6, were torn from their families and forced into slavery. They were subjected to physical and emotional abuse, their childhoods lost forever. Many died during the journey, their small bodies cast into the ocean like trash. Men were treated with equal brutality, forced to endure physical labor, beatings, and humiliation. They were chained, whipped, and subjected to inhumane conditions, their spirits broken and their bodies battered. The journey across the Atlantic was a death sentence for many. Overloading, disease, and starvation claimed countless lives. Thousands were thrown overboard, their bodies fed to the sharks that followed the ships. The ocean became a graveyard, a watery tomb for the countless men, women, and children who perished during the journey. One of the most notorious British slave traders was John Hawkins, who made 3 voyages to Africa in the 1560s, capturing and selling hundreds of Africans into slavery. Hawkins's exploits were celebrated in Britain, and he was even knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. As the British colonial empire expanded, it imposed its rule on various African societies, exploiting their natural resources and forcing them to adopt British customs and laws. In South Africa, the British waged war against the Zulu Kingdom in 1879, killing thousands of Zulu people. The Zulu War, as it came to be known, was sparked by British desires to expand their territory and control the region's rich natural resources. In Kenya, the British colonizers faced resistance from the Mau Mau, a group of Kikuyu people who fought against British rule from 1952 to 1960. The British responded with brutal force, killing tens of thousands of Kenyans and imprisoning many more. The Mau Mau uprising, as it came to be known, was a pivotal moment in Kenya's struggle for independence. Also, the Amritsar massacre, which occurred on April 13, 1919, was another dark stain on Britain's colonial record. British troops opened fire on unarmed Indian protesters in Amritsar, killing hundreds and injuring thousands. The massacre was a turning point in India's struggle for independence, which was finally achieved in 1947. Number 2, the Spanish Empire, conquistadors' reign of terror, from 1492 to 1600. Columbus's discovery opened a floodgate of Spanish exploration. Inspired by tales of rivers of gold and native peoples perceived as timid and malleable, Spanish explorers were relentless in their quest for land and wealth. These explorers, driven by hopes of conquest in the New World, came to be known as conquistadores. Hernán Cortés, one of such conquistadores, arrived on Hispaniola in 1504 and participated in the conquest of the island. Cortés then led the exploration of the Yucatan Peninsula, in hopes of attaining glory. In 1519, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Mexica Empire. Astonished by the sophisticated gardens and temples in the city, he and his men were consumed with intense greed and jealousy, but they were horrified by the practice of human sacrifice. Above all, the Aztec wealth in gold fascinated the Spanish explorers, and with the hope of gaining power over the city, Cortés took Moctezuma, the Aztec ruler, hostage. Then the Spanish murdered hundreds of high-ranking Mexicans during a religious festival, but the people of Tenochtitlan quickly retaliated, making Cortés and his people flee for their lives. Following this defeat, Cortés slowly created alliances and recruited tens of thousands of native peoples who resented the Aztec rule. Only by playing upon the disunity among the diverse groups in the Aztec Empire were the Spanish able to capture Tenochtitlan, the current historic center of Mexico City. By August 1521, Cortés had claimed Tenochtitlan for Spain and renamed it Mexico City. The Spanish conquistadors also brought smallpox to the Americas through their contact with infected people in Europe or Africa before arriving in the New World. One theory is that African slaves, who were immune to smallpox, carried the virus from Africa to the Caribbean, where it spread to the Spanish colonizers. The Spanish then brought the virus to Mexico. Since the indigenous people of Mexico had no immunity to smallpox, the virus spread rapidly, decimating the population. The Spanish, having been exposed to smallpox in Europe, had developed some immunity, which helped protect them from the worst effects of the disease. As a result, the disease exploited the Aztecs' lack of immunity, sweeping through the densely populated city and infecting thousands. The effects were catastrophic, with an estimated 90% of the population killed by the highly contagious and airborne disease. The social and economic fabric of Tenochtitlan began to unravel as the disease spread. Trade and commerce ground to a halt, food became scarce, and the city's infrastructure began to collapse. The once thriving metropolis was now a scene of unimaginable suffering, with the sick and dying filling the streets. But the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan was not just a result of illness. Cortés and his forces employed a range of brutal tactics to subjugate the Aztecs. Violence and brutality were used to overpower the Aztec warriors, while torture and intimidation were used to extract information, gold, and other valuable resources. The Spanish also exploited existing divisions within the Aztec Empire, forming strategic alliances with some factions and neighboring tribes. This clever manipulation of local politics helped to further weaken the Aztec Empire, making it more vulnerable to conquest. Furthermore, the Spanish imposed forced labor and enslavement on the Aztecs, forcing them to work in gold and silver mines, on plantations, and in other industries under brutal conditions. The destruction of Aztec temples, palaces, and other cultural artifacts was also a deliberate attempt to erase the Aztec heritage and impose European culture and religion. In the end, it was not just the Spanish swords that conquered Tenochtitlan, but also the invisible and insidious enemy of smallpox. The city, already reeling from the effects of the disease, was unable to withstand the siege. On August 13, 1521, the Spanish captured the city, marking the fall of the Aztec Empire. The long-term consequences of the smallpox epidemic were dire. The population of Mexico declined drastically, and the indigenous population was forever changed. As if this wasn't enough, another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, made his way to the Spanish Caribbean in 1509, drawn by the promise of wealth and titles. He participated in successful expeditions in Panama before following rumors of Inca wealth to the south. Although his first efforts against the Inca Empire in the 1520s failed, Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and executed him soon thereafter. In 1533, Pizarro founded Lima, Peru. Like Cortés, Pizarro had to combat not only the native peoples of the lands he was conquering, but also competitors from his own country, that a Spanish rival, Diego de Almagro, assassinated him in 1541. Hernando de Soto had participated in Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, and from 1539 to 1542, he led his own expeditions to what is today the southeastern United States. He and his followers explored modern-day Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas, at the same time bringing along with them more European diseases and violence, thereby claiming thousands of native lives. The Aztecs witnessed the smallpox epidemic's destruction personally, and this was described in the Florentine Codex. This is not a fabrication. Indigenous death to such diseases claimed around 50% in Tenochtitlan and up to 90% elsewhere on the continent. Number 3, the Belgian Congo, King Leopold's reign of terror from 1885 to 1908. On February 5, 1885, Belgian King Leopold II established the Congo Free State by brutally seizing the African landmass as his personal possession, rather than controlling the Congo as a colony, as other European powers did throughout Africa. Leopold owned and exploited the region as his private property, robbing the people off their land, resources, and freedom. Leopold financed development projects with money loaned to him from the Belgian government. His stated goal was to bring civilization to the people of the Congo, an enormous region in Central Africa. Leopold's reign over the Congo Free State, however, later became infamous for its brutality. The people of the Congo were forced to labor for valued resources, including rubber and ivory, to personally enrich Leopold. Although the estimates vary, about half the Congolese population died from punishment and malnutrition. Many more suffered from disease and torture. Among those who weren't killed, many were punished by having a hand and/or foot amputated. The people of the Congo did not suffer these injustices without fighting back. Several rebellions were mercilessly put down under Leopold's direction. As news of the atrocities committed by Leopold's agents, including forced labor, mass killings, and mutilations, spread throughout Europe and the United States, public pressure mounted on the government to take action, with many critics, including notable figures like Mark Twain and Roger Casement, condemning Leopold's regime as a gross violation of human rights. Leopold responded to the growing criticism by hiring European mercenaries to defend his interests in the Congo. These mercenaries were usually recruits from European armies who were tasked with maintaining order, suppressing local resistance, and protecting Leopold's economic interests. They were organized into a private army known as the Force Publique, which consisted of up to 19,000 troops. The Force Publique was a stark example of racial segregation, with all officers being white and all rank-and-file soldiers being black men who were forced into service for a minimum of 7 years. Recruits were often acquired through coercive means, such as being bought from tribal leaders or simply kidnapped. These men acted simultaneously as an army of occupation and as a police force which served the interests of the trading companies. The force had to deal with several rebellions, which were put down with horrifying savagery. In practice, the Free State of the Congo was an enormous concentration camp. The 1890s saw the construction of a more reliable transport network in the Congo, built using widespread slave labor. This facilitated the exploitation and exportation of the Congo's natural resources, devastating the local population. The construction of these infrastructures, all created exclusively for personal interests, resulted in the deaths of many workers of all ages. Their working days were long and hard and required an enormous amount of physical effort. According to historical documentation, between 5 to 10 million people died as a result of the colonial exploitation under the rule and administration of King Leopold II and his functionaries. The first-person testimonies that have survived to the present day, and particularly those of Protestant missionaries, writers, and diplomats sent to serve in the Congo, describe and denounce the horror of everyday life in the country. Important sources of information include the stories and data provided by the American missionary G.W. Williams and by the writers Mark Twain, King Leopold's Soliloquy, and Joseph Conrad, as well as others such as the missionary William Safford, the British diplomat Casement, and the journalist Edmund Dean Morell. All of these men produced testimonies that were crucially important for unmasking the truth about one of the darkest episodes of the late 19th century. These critical voices, who revealed the atrocities being inflicted on the Congolese people, were published in the international press, leading to widespread public outcry and calls for the respect for human rights. In 1905, a commission published a report confirming the atrocities committed in the Congo Free State, sparking international outrage and opposition to King Leopold II's rule. The Belgian king faced mounting pressure from demonstrations, protests, and diplomatic maneuvers demanding an end to human rights abuses in the Congo. As public opinion turned against him, even in his home country of Belgium, Leopold II was forced to relinquish control of the Congo Free State. In 1908, the Belgian government officially annexed the territory, renaming it the Belgian Congo. This marked the end of Leopold's personal rule, but the beginning of Belgian colonial rule, which would last until 1960. The Belgian Congo was governed through a colonial charter, with executive power resting with the Belgian Minister of Colonial Affairs. Despite some improvements in conditions, the Belgian government continued to prioritize economic interests over the welfare of the Congolese people. The Congo eventually gained independence on June 30th, 1960, becoming the Republic of the Congo, and later the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1964. 4. Portugal's seaborne empire. The transatlantic slave trade, initiated by Portugal in the 15th century, was a merciless system that forcibly captured and sold millions of Africans into slavery. Enslaved people were packed like sardines on slave ships, their bodies contorted in impossible positions with minimal food, water, and sanitation. The stench of death, disease, and human waste hung heavy in the air as enslaved people succumbed to the harsh conditions. In the Congo Kingdom, the Portuguese colonial masters found a willing ally in the Congo, who was eager to adopt European customs and Christianity. King Manuel I of Portugal and the Congo, Nzinga and Kuwu, established a relationship that was initially beneficial to both parties. However, this alliance soon turned sour as the Portuguese demand for slaves and other commodities led to the exploitation and enslavement of the Congo people. King Afonso I, who ruled the Congo Kingdom from 1509 to 1543, was initially enthusiastic about the Portuguese presence. He adopted Christianity and established trade relationships with the Portuguese. However, he soon became disillusioned with the Portuguese tactics. In a letter to King Manuel I of Portugal, Afonso complained about the behavior of the Portuguese governor, Fernão de Melo, who was selling Congo goods at low prices and buying slaves from other regions. As the slave trade continued to grow, the Congo Kingdom became increasingly unstable. The Congo, who was the head of the Congo people, soon lost his power, and the kingdom was eventually defeated by the Portuguese at the Battle of Mbuila in 1665. The head of the Congo was cut off and put on display, a gruesome symbol of Portuguese brutality. The suffering of black people under Portuguese colonial rule was not limited to just the Congo Kingdom. In Brazil, enslaved Africans were forced to work on sugar plantations, where they were subjected to harsh conditions and brutal punishments. The Portuguese colonizers also imposed their own culture and religion on the enslaved Africans, suppressing their native traditions and beliefs. Dona Ana de Sousa Nzinga, also known as Queen Nzinga, was a formidable warrior queen who resisted Portuguese colonial rule in the 17th century. Born around 1583 in the Kingdom of Ndongo, in present-day Angola, Nzinga was a member of the royal family and was educated in politics, diplomacy, and military strategy from a young age. Nzinga's resistance against the Portuguese began when she was sent as a diplomat to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, in 1621. However, the negotiations failed, and Nzinga returned to Ndongo determined to fight against the Portuguese. Nzinga formed alliances with other African kingdoms, including the Kingdom of Kassanje, and even with the Dutch, who were rival colonizers of the Portuguese. She was a skilled strategist and negotiator, using her knowledge of African politics and diplomacy to outmaneuver the Portuguese. Despite her bravery and strategic thinking, Nzinga faced immense challenges in her fight against the Portuguese. The Portuguese colonial regime was brutal and oppressive, using tactics such as forced labor, torture, and mass killings to maintain control over the African population. The transatlantic slave trade, which was initiated by the Portuguese, was a major factor in the devastation of African communities, with millions of Africans being forcibly captured and sold into slavery, with many more dying during the brutal journey across the Atlantic. In Angola alone, it's estimated that over 1 million people were shipped across the Atlantic as slaves, with many more dying in the process. the slave trade had a devastating impact on African societies, leading to widespread poverty, instability, and cultural destruction. Number 5, French colonialism from mid-1620s to 1960. As at the late 19th century, the French colonial empire, which spanned across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, was marked by brutality, exploitation, and oppression. One of its earliest and most significant colonial endeavors was the scramble for Africa, which began in the late 19th century, specifically during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. France, along with other European powers, partitioned the African continent, with France claiming vast territories in West and Central Africa. The French colonization of Africa was driven by a desire for economic gain, strategic advantage, and cultural superiority. The French believed that they had a civilizing mission to bring European culture, language, and values to the backward African populations. This paternalistic attitude was used to justify the brutal treatment of Africans, who were subjected to forced labor, land expropriation, and cultural suppression. In West Africa, France colonized countries such as Senegal, Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire. The French exploited the region's rich natural resources, including gold, diamonds, and cotton. They also imposed forced labor, which led to the deaths of thousands of Africans. Those who resisted or broke the colonial laws were subjected to unbearable suffering. Imprisonment, which meant being locked away in cramped, unsanitary cells with little food or water. Torture was a regular occurrence, with victims being beaten, whipped, and burned. Some were even forced to endure gruesome procedures, like having their limbs mutilated or their eyes gouged out. Forced labor was equally brutal. Africans were compelled to work long hours in harsh conditions, often in mines, on plantations, or constructing infrastructure projects. They were treated like animals, with little rest, inadequate food, and no pay. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or injuries sustained while working. The trauma and pain inflicted upon them were intentional, designed to break their spirits and maintain control. These atrocities were not isolated incidents, but rather a systemic part of French colonial rule, intended to crush resistance and maintain dominance over the African population. In Central Africa, France colonized countries such as Congo, Gabon, and the Central African Republic. The French exploited the region's vast timber and mineral resources, including uranium and diamonds. They also imposed forced labor, which led to widespread suffering and death. The Congo Free State, a vast territory in Central Africa, controlled by King Leopold II of Belgium, was notorious for its brutal treatment of Africans, including forced labor, mass killings, and mutilations. Although not directly controlled by France, the Congo Free State was heavily influenced by French colonial interests. The French also colonized North Africa, including Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. In Algeria, the French imposed a brutal regime of colonization, which included forced assimilation, land expropriation, and cultural suppression. The Code Noir, a set of laws promulgated by King Louis XIV of France in 1685, governed the treatment of enslaved Africans in the French colonies. The Code Noir's provisions were quite brutal and dehumanizing. Those who dared to defy the Code Noir's draconian laws were met with a fate worse than death itself. They were subjected to an existence of unrelenting agony, a never-ending cycle of suffering that shattered bodies, minds, and spirits. Torture was a favorite tool of the colonial masters, a means to extract obedience and crush resistance. Whips cracked through the air, leaving scars that would never heal. Brands seared into flesh, a permanent reminder of the enslaved status. Mutilation was a twisted punishment, leaving victims maimed and crippled. Imprisonment was another cruel fate, as captives were thrown into damp, cramped cells with little food or water. The stench of rot and decay hanging heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the bleakness of their existence. Forced labor was also another living hell, as enslaved Africans were compelled to toil in hazardous conditions, their bodies broken by the relentless demands of their captors. Mines, plantations, and construction sites became battlefields where lives were lost and souls were crushed. And for those who refused to submit, execution was the ultimate punishment. The hangman's noose or the firing squad's bullets waited patiently, ready to snuff out the lives of those who dared to resist. Death was a mercy, a release from the endless suffering, but even that was often denied, as victims were left to linger, their bodies broken, their minds shattered. This was the gruesome reality of life under the Code Noir, a system designed to dehumanize, to degrade, and to destroy. It was a machinery of oppression, a tool of terror, and a testament to the darkest aspects of human nature. Many African leaders who resisted French colonial rule were killed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Samurai Touré was one of such leaders that fought against French colonial rule in the late 19th century. Abdelkader, an Algerian leader, fought against French colonial rule in the mid-19th century. Lamine Gueye, a Senegalese leader, fought for African independence and equality in the early 20th century. Despite the brutality of French colonial rule, many Africans resisted and fought for their freedom and independence. The African independence movement, which began in the mid-20th century, was marked by widespread protests, strikes, and armed struggles against French colonial rule. In 1960, a wave of African independence movements swept across the continent, with many countries gaining independence from French colonial rule. However, the legacy of French colonialism continues to impact African societies and economies today. 6. Boer concentration camps, 1899 to 1902. The Anglo-Boer War, or South African War, was a conflict fought between the British Empire and the two Boer republics, the South African Republic and Orange Free State, over the empire's influence in southern Africa. The Witwatersrand gold rush caused a large influx of foreigners, Uitlanders, to the South African Republic, SAR, mostly British from the Cape Colony, as they, for fear of a hostile takeover of the SAR, were permitted to vote only after 14 years of residence. They protested to the British authorities in the Cape. With failed negotiations at the botched Bloemfontein Conference in June 1899, a conflict broke out in October after the British government decided to send 10,000 troops to South Africa. With a delay, this provoked a Boer and British ultimatum and subsequent Boer irregulars and militia attacks on British colonial settlements in Natal Colony. The Boers placed Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking under siege and won victories at Colenso, Magersfontein, and Stormberg. Increased numbers of British Army soldiers were brought to southern Africa and mounted unsuccessful attacks against the Boers. However, British fortunes changed when their commanding officer, General Redvers Buller, was replaced by Lord Roberts and Lord Kitchener, who relieved the besieged cities and invaded the Boer republics in early 1900 at the head of a 180,000-strong expeditionary force. The Boers, aware that they were unable to resist such a large force, refrained from fighting pitched battles, allowing the British to occupy both republics and their capitals, Pretoria and Bloemfontein. Boer politicians, including President of the South African Republic Paul Kruger, either fled or went into hiding. The British Empire officially annexed the two republics in 1900. In Britain, the Conservative ministry led by Lord Salisbury attempted to capitalize on British military successes by calling an early general election, dubbed by contemporary observers as a khaki election. However, Boer fighters took to the hills and launched a guerrilla campaign, becoming known as Bitter Anders. Led by generals such as Louis Botha, John Smuts, Christian de Wet, and Koos de la Rey, Boer guerrillas used hit-and-run attacks and ambushes against the British for 2 years. The guerrilla campaign proved difficult for the British to defeat due to unfamiliarity with guerrilla tactics and extensive support for the guerrillas among civilians. In response to failures to defeat the guerrillas, British High Command ordered scorched earth policies as part of a large-scale and multi-pronged counterinsurgency campaign. A network of nets, blockhouses, strong points, and barbed wire fences was constructed, virtually partitioning the occupied republics. The clearance and destruction of farms by British forces, including New Zealand troops, was intended to remove the main source of support for the Boer commandos. As a result, women and children were left without shelter, food, or protection from local tribes who the British had encouraged to settle old scores with the Boers. Camps were hurriedly constructed to house them. At least 40 concentration camps were constructed, holding in all some 150,000 Boer refugees. Some, such as Merebank near Durban, which housed more than 9,000 internees, resembled small towns. Another 60 camps were constructed to house the 115,000 native Africans who had worked as servants for the Boers. Due to their hasty conception and the difficulties of accommodating a displaced population, The camps offered the bare minimum in terms of housing and supplies, with many internees being forced to live in tents. The camps, however, were poorly conceived and managed, and were ill-equipped to handle the large numbers of detainees, leading to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and shelter. There were two scales of rations, less for those whose husbands or sons were still fighting against the British. Overcrowding and unsanitary conditions soon led to outbreaks of disease, with typhoid, malaria, measles, and dysentery becoming rife. Many British doctors and colonial nurses were shocked by the traditional remedies often employed by the Boers. One supposed cure for typhoid involved placing the warm stomach of a freshly slaughtered sheep on the patient's chest. Approximately 100,000 Boer civilians, predominantly women and children, were forcibly relocated to concentration camps, where they faced unimaginable hardship. Tragically, around 26,000 of these internees succumbed to starvation and disease, resulting in one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Second Boer War. In addition to the Boer civilians, Black Africans were also interned in concentration camps, as the British sought to prevent them from supplying the Boers with food and other essential resources. Unfortunately, this led to the deaths of about 20,000 Black Africans in these camps. As reports of the harsh conditions and suffering endured by internees in the concentration camps emerged, a public outcry ensued, and the British government faced intense criticism and condemnation for their treatment of the Boer civilians. Social reformer Emily Hobhouse inspected the camps, much to the ire of the military, and publicized the terrible conditions. British Liberal Party leader Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman declared them methods of barbarism. As a result of public pressure, the British authorities belatedly made improvements, and the death rate fell. At the end of 1901, these criticisms, combined with the desire to end the war, caused the British to adopt a new policy towards displaced Boer families. Rather than being removed from the camps, they were left to fend for themselves. The aim was to burden the Boer commandos so that they would be unable to continue their guerrilla campaign. British mounted infantry were deployed to track down guerrillas, leading to small-scale skirmishes. Few combatants on either side were killed in action, with most casualties dying from disease. Kitchener, on the other hand, offered generous terms of surrender to remaining Boer leaders to end the conflict. Eager to ensure fellow Boers were released from the camps, most Boer commanders accepted the British terms in the Treaty of Vereeniging, surrendering in May 1902. The former republics were then transformed into the British colonies of the Transvaal and Orange River, and in 1910 were merged with the Natal and Cape colonies to form the Union of South Africa, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. The suffering experienced in the camps left a lasting legacy of bitterness amongst the Boers, leaving over 18,000 to 28,000 Boers dead, with about 80% of them being children. Number 7, the Italian concentration camps in Libya, 1911 to 1943. Like other European powers in the 19th century, Italy looked to Africa for potential resources, markets, and as a way to garner prestige in the international arena. Italy itself had only been unified in 1871, a decade before it made its first venture south into Ethiopia. Before World War II, the Italian Empire, with its conscious echoes of the Roman Empire, held at its height a good chunk of North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the eastern shore of the Adriatic, and a handful of Greek islands. The Italian invasion of Libya began on October 4, 1911, when Italian government troops captured Tripoli, Libya's capital and largest city, from Turkish troops. This marked the beginning of a brutal period of Italian colonization that would last for over 3 decades. The Italian army's invasion was facilitated by the fact that the Ottoman government had sent its Libyan battalions to Yemen to suppress local rebellions, leaving only military police in Libya. As a result, the Ottomans didn't have a full army in Tripolitania, making it easier for the Italians to gain control. Italy's motivations for invading Libya were rooted in its desire to expand its colonial empire and secure new markets and resources. The Italian government had long been interested in establishing a foothold in North Africa, and Libya, with its strategic location and potential for economic growth, was an attractive target. During this period, the Italian government implemented various policies aimed at modernizing and developing the region, including the construction of infrastructure, the promotion of agriculture, and the establishment of a new administrative system. In the early years of Italian rule, the Libyan population resisted fiercely, leading to numerous clashes between Italian forces and Libyan rebels. One of the most significant confrontations took place near Ras Al Laban on September 17, 1912. It was a brutal clash between the Italian government soldiers and Senussi tribesmen. The Italian forces, seeking to assert their control over the region, had been advancing on the Senussi positions. The Senussi, determined to defend their territory and way of life, had gathered to resist the Italian invasion. As the Italian forces approached, the Senussi tribesmen launched a fierce attack, using their knowledge of the desert terrain to their advantage. The Italian soldiers, weighed down by their heavy equipment and unfamiliar with the harsh desert conditions, were quickly overwhelmed. Despite being outnumbered, the Italian forces held their ground, and an intense battle ensued. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. In the end, the Italian forces emerged victorious, but at a great cost. The Senussi tribesmen suffered devastating losses, with over 1,200 killed in the battle. The Italian forces also suffered significant casualties, with 200 soldiers killed. Despite this, the Italian government continued to assert its control over Libyan territory, with the Treaty of Lausanne, signed on October 17, 1912, recognizing Italian sovereignty. The Italian government's efforts to consolidate its power were met with resistance from various Arab tribes. On March 23, 1913, government troops suppressed an Arab rebellion in the Tripolitanian region, and by April 13, 1913, they had launched another attack on Senussi tribesmen near Bana, resulting in the deaths of 200 tribesmen. The conflict continued to escalate, with government troops clashing with Arab tribesmen near Sidi Aziz on May 16, 1913, and suffering over 70 casualties. Many Arab tribesmen were forced to flee, with 3,000 seeking refuge in French Tunisia under the leadership of Sheikh Souf al-Mahmoudi and Sheikh Harb al-Naili. Another 600 tribesmen, led by Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah al-Busayfi, fled to the Fezzan region, although Sheikh al-Busayfi was killed by government troops near Mahruga on December 24, 1913. The conflict persisted, with government troops and Senussi tribesmen clashing in the Benghazi region in February 1914, resulting in the deaths of 280 tribesmen and 35 government soldiers. The Italian government continued to expand its control, occupying Ghat in the Fezzan region on August 12, 1914. However, Arab tribesmen rebelled against government troops in the Fezzan and Jabal regions, beginning on September 28, 1914, and achieving several victories, including the capture of Marzouk and Ghat from government troops in December 1914. As the conflict escalated, Italian forces employed increasingly brutal tactics to suppress the rebellion. In 1915, Italian troops suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Libyan rebels near Gasser Buhadi, leading to the deaths of 735 Italian and Libyan soldiers. In retaliation, Colonel Miani ordered the execution of 700 Libyan civilians. The Italian authorities established a network of concentration camps to detain and punish Libyan rebels and civilians suspected of supporting the resistance. Conditions in these camps were brutal, with prisoners facing forced labor, starvation, and disease. Many prisoners were also subjected to physical and psychological torture. One of the most notorious concentration camps was the Soluk camp, where thousands of Libyans were imprisoned and subjected to inhumane treatment. Prisoners were forced to work in harsh conditions, building infrastructure projects and farming the land. Many prisoners died due to the harsh conditions, with estimates suggesting that up to 50,000 Libyans died in Italian concentration camps between 1929 and 1934. The Italian authorities also implemented a policy of forced relocation, moving entire communities from their ancestral lands to concentration camps. This policy was designed to break the spirit of the Libyan people and crush the rebellion once and for all. Despite these brutal tactics, the Libyan resistance continued to fight against Italian rule. The rebellion was led by figures such as Omar Mukhtar, who became a national hero for his bravery and determination. The Italian occupation of Libya finally came to an end in 1943, when Allied forces defeated the Italian army during World War II. The legacy of Italian colonialism in Libya remains a painful and contentious issue to this day, with many Libyans still seeking justice and compensation for the atrocities committed against their ancestors. Number 8. The U.S. mass killings in the Philippines, 1899 to 1913. The entire Philippine-American War all began because of a broken promise. During the Spanish-American War, Filipinos were led to believe that they would gain independence if they helped the Americans defeat Spain. In fact, the Filipinos had already been fighting for independence, inspired by the American Revolution. In May 1898, the American Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino leader, then declared independence and established a constitutional government in June 1898. However, when the Spanish surrendered Manila, the Americans refused to let the Filipinos enter the city, creating tensions. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, granted the U.S. control over the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Feeling betrayed, the Filipinos rebelled against American rule, leading to a brutal war that lasted from 1899 to 1913. In Manila, American soldiers engaged in questionable behavior, entering people's homes without warrants and stealing goods from stores. This behavior was eerily parallel to that of English soldiers in Boston in 1775. The Americans sought to expand their control over the Philippines, but they only held Manila, while the rest of the country was controlled by Filipino revolutionaries. As a result, conflict between the two parties was inevitable. The U.S. claimed to be liberators in the Philippines, but their true intentions were far from altruistic. They sought to conquer the country to establish a military base in Asia, allowing them to project American power and gain access to Asian markets. The U.S. wanted to sell American products in places like China and control the Philippines' natural resources, including gold, iron ore, chromite, lead, and many more. This is extremely ironic, given that America was preaching about democracy and self-determination at the time, emphasizing the right of all people to be independent and govern themselves. However, the truth was that the U.S. wanted to become a world power and was practicing imperialism. This hypocrisy is part of the reason why the Philippine-American War is often overlooked. Another reason for the war's relative obscurity is the way it was conducted. The brutal tactics employed by American forces were not something to be proud of, and as a result, the war has been largely swept under the rug. In November 1901, a reporter from the Philadelphia Ledger wrote, "Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners, captives, active insurgents, and suspected people from lads up to 10, the idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog." The letters from the American soldiers also provided a first-hand account of the atrocities committed by U.S. forces against Filipino civilians. These letters, often written to family and friends back home, revealed the brutal treatment of Filipinos, including massacres, torture, and forced relocation. Many soldiers wrote about the widespread destruction of villages, crops, and livestock, leaving civilians without food or shelter. They also described the use of torture, such as the water cure, to extract information from Filipino prisoners. Some letters mentioned specific massacres, like the Balangiga massacre, where American troops killed thousands of Filipino civilians in retaliation for a surprise attack. Other letters spoke of the forced relocation of Filipinos to concentration camps, where they were subjected to harsh conditions, disease, and starvation. These letters not only exposed the brutality of the U.S. military's actions in the Philippines, but also highlighted the racist attitudes of many American soldiers towards Filipinos. The letters often referred to Filipinos as natives, savages, or gooks, reflecting a deep-seated racism that contributed to the violence and atrocities committed during the war. In closing, it's okay to say that the brutal subjugation of indigenous populations, the ruthless exploitation of resources, and the devastation of cultures were not isolated incidents, but rather a pervasive pattern of violence and oppression perpetrated by the European colonists. These gruesome atrocities had resulted in the loss of countless lives, the erasure of identities, and the displacement of communities. On the other hand, the lack of accountability and justice for these crimes is a painful reminder of the ongoing struggle for decolonization and reconciliation. Remembering and learning from these dark chapters in history is crucial for building a more equitable and just world. This brings us to the end of yet another touching video segment. Did you find this video quite informative? Then support our works by hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading these eye-opening contents, and subscribe to stay tuned in with us if you are yet to. We are glad to have you on this journey with us. Thank you for watching. See you in our next video.